Good morning, global gardeners, and good evening to other global gardeners. It's great to have you all here for another Monday packed with gardening information. Go ahead and pull off the top of your head because we're going to pour a whole bunch into that brain today. We'll talk primarily about pollination and cross-pollination and pollinators and all those kind of fun things. And it's going to be probably more than you expected because this is one of those subjects that we all understand sort of a little bit, but you can really delve deep and dark into the science of pollination. So we'll get to that. It's great to see everybody checking in. Great to have everybody here today. I want to go ahead and get started right away with a question from Mage Grey Wolf, wondering about what's the favorite food of rabbits, so that the rabbits don't eat anything else in your garden, the sweet potatoes in this case. And what I found in my garden, at least this time of year, the rabbits are preferring to eat the plants that are young and green and close to the surface of the ground. They don't want to jump into beds and eat if they don't have to. And so it's that young, sweet grass that I'm finding works best for getting the rabbits away from my garden. And so as I'm expanding my garden and putting in new beds, whenever I come across some of those native grasses that I have, I dig them up and put them over off to the side to try to develop a clump, or basically a large area of some of the grasses that I notice the rabbits are eating more often. You might have something along those lines in your garden space, or just go ahead and find some grass seed that you might be able to plant on the outskirts and edges of your garden and see if maybe the rabbits don't like to eat that first. It doesn't mean they're not going to eat the rest of your garden, but if it's easy for them, then they'll probably take that. The problem is a rabbit or two or three can go through grass pretty quickly, so you might have a large area that's needed to take care of your rabbits. But that's what I found. If any of the rest of you are allowing the rabbits in your garden area and you've noticed that they like a particular type of plant over others, go ahead and share it in the comments today. Great to see Paul and Kevin and Nachi G, Barbara Finley, Linda Hardwick, Greg, Pat. We've got Heidi, we've got Jay, we've got Laura Full. Everybody's checking in. It's great to have you all here on a Monday. It's a beautiful Monday here in Colorado in my Zone 5B garden. This is the first morning that I've been able to go outside and say, wow, it's not cold. We've had some really cold snaps recently. The wind and the cold this weekend was horrendous, but the weather finally is up to normal for me, and I'm looking forward to a great gardening week of my own with lots of work. I have a truckload of amended soil being delivered today so that I can finish filling my metal beds. I've put some seeds in the ground. I've got some transplanting to do. It's just a wonderful time of year. There was a question last week that I'll touch on right now as well before we get into the main topic of the day about mushrooms and whether mushrooms are hazardous in your garden. Well, one of the things that I've really enjoyed seeing in the last couple days is I have more mushrooms coming up than I ever have, and in huge clumps. And partly it's because of the cool, cold, wet weather that I've been having. So I love soil. I think soil is key to success in the garden, and mushrooms are an indication that your soil is probably healthier than you suspect, because most of us really focus on compost, which is an organic material that is decomposed primarily by bacteria. And if you do any reading about the soil food web, you'll begin to learn that fungi are very important to have in your soil. And so while most of us focus on the compost and the bacteria, we should also start focusing some of our efforts on developing the fungi within our soil. Now, I use a lot of wood chip mulch, and one of the reasons for that is because that's what the fungi eats. The bacteria eats like the leafy parts of the plants, but the fungi are eating the woody parts of plants. And so particularly in my front yard where I have it all mulched with wood, the growth of the fungi is just phenomenal. So it's exactly what I want. You get those mycelial networks, all those little white fibers working their way through the soil, and that's what starts breaking down all that woody material. It's either in the ground or at the very surface where the mulch is. Well, the mushroom is just the fruit of all that fungi. It's the fruiting body. So when you see the mushroom, that's telling you that the fungi is present in your soil. You may never see mushrooms. It usually takes the cool, wet conditions for that fungi to fruit and for the mushrooms to emerge. But when they do, it's awesome. So it really isn't hazardous to your garden. It's one of those things that shows a healthy system. And you can take the mushrooms and add them to your compost pile. Unless you're an expert and you know exactly what kind of mushrooms you have, I would not advise even tasting them, because there are some mushrooms that even a taste can be deadly. But you can put them in your compost pile to use as a future amendment in your soil. I also, just in the last couple of weeks, saw that my straw bale, where I'm growing blue oyster mushrooms on purpose, has also started sprouting those beautiful mushrooms. So it's really a nice mushroom week for me. And if you see mushrooms in your garden, don't worry about it. You can cut them down. You don't have to throw them in your compost pile. Maybe the chickens might want to eat the mushrooms, but it's one of those things that relax about it and realize you're doing something right when you see the mushrooms, because your soil is starting to reach a balance between the bacteria and the fungi, and you'll be able to actually grow more plants in a space that has that balance than in a space that might just be bacterial dominant. So there you have it. Great day for mushrooms, and I'm looking forward to mushrooms in my back garden, because that's the area where I'm really starting to develop the soil as we speak. Okay, let's see. Paul's asking, how far apart should tomatoes be planted from each other to prevent cross-pollination between different breeds? I'm concerned about my Everglade tomatoes crossing with everything. So, great way to start the conversation about cross-pollination. And tomatoes are one of those things that we're most interested in. And so one of the nice things about tomatoes is they have what we call a perfect flower. And so here's how pollination works. You basically have a male part of a flower and a female part of the flower. You've got the stamen, which is the male part, and the stigma, which is the female part. And pollen goes from the male part to the female part to pollinate. And then fruit develops. And so if you really want to get more technical, the anther is the part that actually has the male pollen, and it's the pistil that develops into the fruit. And so something needs to transfer the male pollen to the female part of the plant for that fruit to develop. Now in a tomato, the reason I call it a perfect flower is because the flower contains both the male parts and the female parts. And all that's required is a little bit of wind, a shaking of the plant, the flapping of a bee's wings, just something to disrupt that pollen to fall onto the pistil for the fruit to develop. And within the plants that have the perfect flowers, and so it's pepper plants, it's eggplants, it's tomatoes, it's beans, it's peas, you really don't need a pollinator. You don't need a fly buzzing back and forth. You don't need a hummingbird. You don't need a bee. You just need something to disrupt the plant. And usually a breeze is enough. Or if you just brush up against the plant and knock it a little bit, that's enough to pollinate the flower. And once that flower is pollinated, once that male pollen falls onto the pistil, well, there's not going to be any danger of cross-pollination at that point, because the flower has pollinated itself. So, to answer your question, particularly with tomatoes, just to be on the safe side, you can plant them 10 feet apart, 8 feet apart, 20 feet apart. 3 feet apart. It's not that critical because the flower is going to pollinate itself with a high degree of probability before it would be cross-pollinated by an insect. If you are very concerned about it, then you really need to separate by a large distance, because 3 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, 20 feet is not going to be enough distance to keep a bee from traveling between those flowers. So in case of tomatoes, I actually don't worry about the distance between plants because my garden isn't that big. If cross-pollination is a concern, 10 or 20 feet, like I just said, isn't going to make a difference between the insects. And so you can grow your tomatoes 2 feet apart, you can grow them 10 feet apart, you can grow them 50 feet apart and still have the same likelihood of cross-pollination, which is very, very low. You can hand pollinate just about all flowers, and if you choose to do that because you're concerned about cross-pollination, you need to put some type of barrier up to keep an insect from cross-pollinating. So one of the things that I think is beneficial if you're concerned particularly with those perfect flowers that are pollinating themselves is go out early in the morning and shake your plants. Just knock around your plants so that they pollinate first thing in the morning. Then you don't have to worry about it for the rest of the day. You don't have to worry about those insects causing potential cross-pollination. And then you can just go about your day without too much concern. I've been growing tomatoes 18 inches apart up trellises for years and years and years and saving my seeds. And I've never had any new tomato plant develop as a result of some cross-pollination that had taken place. I always get true plants in the next year. So there you have it. Not anything to be worried much about when it comes to those plants with the perfect flowers. So we'll be talking a lot more about how all these things fit together. Let's see what else we have popping up if we have anything. Laurel says we brush pollinate the inside of strawberries. There you go. With pollen from the outside of strawberries. That's not a bad idea. And so I do have a video out there where I show how I hand pollinate my pumpkins. And you can do this with most flowers. It's more difficult with the smaller flowers, but you can easily do that where you pick a flower off the plant and put it onto the flower somewhere else on the plant or on a plant someplace else, and you can improve the pollination. So now let's talk about why we might want to do that and why pollination is important in the first place, because sometimes it's not important at all. It all depends on the plant that you're growing. So the thing about pollination, like we talked about, is it moves the male pollen to the female part of the plant to generate fruit. If you're growing a plant in your garden to eat that has nothing to do with the fruit of the plant, then pollination is a non-issue. So if you're growing brassicas or herbs, any of those type of plants, if you're growing root crops, carrots don't need pollination to give you a carrot root. Spinach does not require pollination for you to harvest the leaf of the spinach and use it in a salad. Thyme or oregano or sage does not require pollination for you to harvest the leaves. And so think about that right off the bat. A lot of people are very concerned about the pollinators in their garden, but if you're not growing a fruiting plant, then it really doesn't matter. And if you are growing a fruiting plant, it may not be much of an issue either. And so that's why we're talking about if we're growing the fruits like peppers and tomatoes, that's because of the perfect flower. Now, so this is where it starts getting really crazy. Okay. So you have some flowers that are perfect. They've got both the male part and the female part within the same flower. Well, there are many other plants out there that have imperfect flowers. In other words, the flower is either a male flower or a female flower. And so squashes are that way, and melons are that way. And that's one reason why it's so easy to hand pollinate a squash plant or a pumpkin or a melon, because you've got a flower that is nothing but the stamen. And then you have another plant that is nothing but the stigma. So one is the male and one is the female. Now, in that case, you do have to require a pollinator, because let's talk about pumpkin plants, for instance. If you don't have the male pollen moved from the male flower to the female flower, a pumpkin will not develop. It will not develop in that female flower unless the female flower is pollinated by the male's pollen, which means you've got to attract pollinators to your garden, or you have to do it yourself, where you pick off a male flower and then hand pollinate the female flower, like I show in that video from last year. If you have the hand pollination, or you do have those flying insects or those birds that take care of pollination, then you should expect a fruit to develop. Now, nature has this all figured out, and so particularly early in the season, when you see melon plants or squash plants, you'll see a lot of flowers that develop. And I get this question every year often. Why am I getting a whole bunch of flowers on my squash plants and no fruit? And so what happens is the plant actually starts producing nothing but male flowers at first. And so for the first day, maybe for the first week, maybe for the first 2 weeks, only male flowers are going to develop on that plant. And then the female flowers will start developing. And the reason for this is, put yourself in the mind of a pumpkin plant. If your very first flower is a female flower, if there are no other male flowers to pollinate it, you've just wasted all that effort developing a female flower. And now the female flower dies without pollinating, and you've lost the potential for fruit. But if I were a pumpkin plant, I would do the same thing. I would start growing male flowers. Now when I grow a single female flower, there might be 5 or 6 or 8 male flowers already in place, ready for that pollination. And now when the bee shows up, or the butterfly shows up, or the fly shows up, they're landing on many more male flowers than there are female flowers. So the likelihood of pollination has increased because there are more male flowers than there are female flowers. And so as those insects flit back and forth between the flowers, they're more likely to go from male to male to female to male to male to male to female, and they're carrying that pollen back and forth, and in the process causing or the result is more likely to be pollination for that fruit. So that's the craziness of the different types of plants. And now let's move it to another level where we have some plants that are actually, we've got 2 different terms, and I encourage you to do more research and look into all of this as we move forward. So we have monoecious plants. And so when I'm talking about a squash, that means it has male flowers and female flowers on the same plant, monoecious. But then you've got dioecious plants, which means the plant is either a male or a female. And you have to have both plants to be able to expect any type of fruit. And so I was growing sea berries at the Galileo Garden a number of years ago, and I had sea berries, which most people don't know about. It's a little berry packed with antioxidants. And I had 3 plants that were donated, and I asked the question, are these male or female plants? And the person giving me the plants had just dug them up and didn't know the answer. They didn't know the concept of dioecious plants. Well, sea berries are either a male or a female. And so for me to expect to get sea berries, I had to grow all 3 plants with the hope that at least one of them would end up being female. And and the other way around, at least one of them were to be male for that pollination to take place and for any berries to result. And luckily, in that particular case, we did have one of the plants that ended up being male. So as you think about your garden and the plants that put into place, this is one of those things. When the catalog or the nursery recommends that you get 2 plants, usually it's because the pollination needs to take place. If they're more specific and they say you need to have a male plant and a female plant, you definitely need to do that. Kiwi is a perfect example of this. I grew kiwis in the school garden as well. You've got to have at least 1 male plant. And typically 1 male plant is good for 4 or 5 female plants. And so that's what I did. I had 1 male kiwi and I had 3 female kiwi plants because they're dioecious. You have to think about those kind of things. And so now we take it even a step further where you have flowers that have both the male and the female parts, but to be pollinated, they require a completely different variety of that particular plant. And apples are the best example of this. There are some self-pollinating apples, but often those are from trees that have grafted different varieties onto the same tree. If you have a single apple tree, you shouldn't expect that you'll ever get apples. You can have the tree filled with flowers, but the tree will not pollinate itself. On that tree are both the male and the female parts of the flowers, but there's just these plants that just need a different variety. So you've got to grow 2 apple trees if you want to get any apples. And if you don't, well, then don't be surprised if nothing results. And this is why apples are always hybrids. Every time that you grow an apple and save the seed, it is going to be a hybrid, because for that fruit to develop requires 2 distinct varieties to pollinate that flower and produce that fruit. And now the resulting seed is going to be something totally different. So every single apple tree that we're growing in our garden that we know is a specific type of fruit has been grafted. It's a clone from some parent plant years and years ago, because apples do not bear true. And so now we get into basically the overall idea behind pollination as well, which is that we have this concept of species and hybrids and varieties. And so you can't have one species pollinate another species. So you have apple trees, which are one species of fruit, and you have cherry trees, which are a completely different variety of fruit. There is a 0 possibility that the cherries will pollinate the apples, and vice versa. You can carry this down into your garden bed level as well. You have to have the same species. So if you're trying to grow pumpkins and right next to those pumpkins you grow a watermelon, those are completely different species. They can't pollinate each other. And so just because you're growing big fruit, a pumpkin is as big as a watermelon, that doesn't have anything to do with it. They can't pollinate each other. If you get plants that are within the same species, you have a yellow squash and you have a zucchini, those species are close enough that you might expect some cross-pollination. And so now let's delve into this idea where we hopefully understand the whole concept of how pollen has to move from the male to the female, and it might be on the same plant, it might be on a different plant. Some plants, particularly trees, require the pollen to come from a different variety. Well, now let's get down to this concern about cross-pollination, which is one of those questions that I'm asked more than any other. First off, it has to be a plant that is flowering at the same time. So if you have a yellow squash and like a long neck squash, a crook neck squash, and a spaghetti squash, and both plants are flowering at the same time, it is possible that the pollen could be moved from one flower on one plant to another flower on another plant. Okay, that flower on the female part of the plant that's going to develop into a fruit becomes pollinated and starts growing. Well, if you have a yellow crookneck squash that was fertilized, pollinated by some other type of squash, and that year, this year, on that plant, this plant, you're going to get yellow crookneck squash. It doesn't matter what other variety pollinated it, you're going to get the exact fruit that you're expecting from that plant in this year. And that's very important to remember. There are myths out there. There's a lot of misinformation with people saying, well, I grew watermelon next to squash and the squash tasted like watermelon. Well, pure coincidence. First off, they can't pollinate each other. But if you're growing a yellow squash and you're growing it next to a black squash, the taste is not going to change based on the pollination from the other plant. It's going to be exactly what you're growing. So it's being cross-pollinated, but you're still getting the plant that you want. That's an important factor. That's why I'm saying it over and over again. You don't have to worry about cross-pollination in this year. Where it becomes a concern is if you save the seed, and only if you save the seed. And so the apple tree, you're growing a gala apple, and it's being pollinated by a golden delicious apple flower. Well, you're going to grow gala apples, and they're going to taste like gala apples. But if you save the seed to grow next year, that seed's going to be a hybrid. And so the tree that you would grow from that seed would be a cross between the gala apple and the whatever the other pollinator happened to be, a golden delicious. The same holds true for your squash. The squash you're growing this year would be a yellow crookneck squash, but next year, if you saved the seed and planted it, the resulting plant would be a hybrid between the crookneck and the yellow zucchini or whatever happened to be. So there you have it. There's an overview. Now let's go through some questions that you might have to see if there's something that still doesn't stick or something else that you are concerned about when it comes to pollination, because there's the broad stroke as far as how it all fits. And let's see what else you're concerned about. Susan, great to see you checking in. Elsa says, research the different parts you'll need. You can use whole dandelions. Obviously, this is something else that you're talking about. My video coming up here in a couple days about dandelions. So I'll save all of that for the video, but let's see what you're talking about. Okay. Phil says, how long would you wait to plant a second type of corn? Philly, zone 6B, so only have one season to plant. Great question. And so this carries it to the next level. And so as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, the plants have to be flowering at the same time for the pollination to take place. And in almost all cases, that means the same day. And often it's within the same hour because pollen deteriorates very quickly, especially in the sun or the rain or the wind. It's gone and it doesn't last. And so the flowers have to be pollinating at the same time for pollination to take place. Holds true with corn. Now, we don't really think of corn as having flowers that need to be pollinated, but it's essentially the same thing. You've got the male pollen that needs to fall onto the female part of the plant for the fruit to develop. And for us, it's all those little kernels. And so if you have ears of corn that you're growing, if you have complete pollination, then you're going to have those hundreds of kernels that you see on your corn cob. If you harvest your corn cob and there are gaps, if there are holes where kernels should be but there aren't, that's because that particular part of the cob did not get pollinated. And so now we move to a whole nother area, and I'll get to the specific answer in just a little bit. But how plants are pollinated. because we've been talking about pollinators so far, and we've been talking about just jostling the plant to disrupt the pollen. There are plants like corn that are wind pollinated, where the wind will actually blow the pollen from one plant of corn onto the tassels of the second plant of corn, and that's how pollination takes place. And so that's why you have to block or plant in blocks where you have a number of corn plants close together to each other, so that when the wind comes, or you can get out there and shake it really vigorously, that can work too if you don't have any wind. But that pollen needs to be distributed to those other plants, usually and almost always by wind in corn. Okay, that's the way that pollination takes place. And so when you have the pollination, just like all the other plants, once those kernels that are going to result, once that fruiting part of the corn is pollinated, you don't have to worry about it anymore. And so to answer your question, if you want to grow different types of corn, and this holds true for all the different types of plants that you're growing, if you can have that second crop, the succession planting part where you're growing something different, it just needs to be separated by time so that that first crop has grown, flowered, pollinated, and started to set the seed in the case of the corn, because corn is a seed. 2 weeks is usually enough. 3 weeks is ideal. You can start your second crop. Now that second crop is growing. It's going to reach the same life cycle stage where the pollen is going to develop. It needs wind. It needs to pollinate it. Well, that first crop is already growing the ears of corn. It's already been pollinated. And so depending on the variety of corn in particular, almost always it's going to flower and pollinate within a very short period of time, just a few days, because it all has to happen quickly, or else those ears of corn are not going to be pollinated. So you're not going to see, in most cases, the corn stretch out over 2 or 3 weeks for pollination to take place. It's happening in a very condensed period of time, which is why usually 2 weeks is more than enough for you to plant a second crop of corn. And you can do that. If you've got a long enough season, you can grow something like corn throughout the season, just putting in a new crop every 2 or 3 weeks, and you shouldn't have any concerns about the cross-pollination. Now, again, back to the concept of cross-pollination. It's not that big a deal for one variety of corn to cross-pollinate another variety of corn. If you're growing popcorn and sweet corn, yeah, they might cross-pollinate. But if you're going to eat the corn in that same year, it really doesn't matter if they're cross-pollinated or not. It's only a concern if you're planning on saving the corn seed to grow more of that particular type of corn in the following season. So it's nice to keep the plant separate and not worry about the cross-pollination with something like corn, but it's really only a concern if you're planning on saving the seed. So now let's back up to the squashes and the tomatoes and all those other things that we're growing. You can take the same basic approach where you stagger your plantings based on the life cycle of the plant. And so I do this a lot with cucumbers, where I am going to save the seed of the cucumbers and I don't want them to be cross-pollinated. So what I do in that case, because I'm growing pickling cucumbers and I'm growing slicing cucumbers, the type of cucumber that I want to save the seed from is the one that I grow first. So let's say I want to save some Boston pickling cucumber seeds. I start my Boston pickling cucumbers, let them grow, let them flower, let them fruit, and then I save the seed of those very first cucumbers, because that's the only cucumber I'm growing in my garden, and I know that those seeds will be true for the following year. About 2 weeks after I start my Boston pickling cucumbers, then I start the other cucumbers that I want to grow in my garden. And because that Boston Boston pickling cucumber flower is going to be pollinated before any of those slicing cucumber flowers even show up. That's why I can feel so confident. Later in the season, I don't care if those two different varieties of cucumbers are pollinating each other, because I'm not saving any more seed past that point. And I can harvest the pickling cucumbers or harvest the slicing cucumbers, and the seeds are a non-issue because I'm not saving them again for the next year. So a couple different things to think about. It's all about the seeds. It's all about the hybridization based on that cross-pollination and whether that's even a concern or not. Yankee Sister, good to see you here live. I know you only are able to join us every few weeks or so. Great to have you here. Thank you so much for that contribution, and I appreciate that. That's nice. It's always good to have you here on the chat. Okay, let's see what else we have. Keep those questions coming. I know I've been pumping out information, and you can always watch this on replay. If I said something that I was talking too fast or you missed the concept, you can always watch it in replay. That's something to do. Claudia's asking, my tomato plants are giving me fruits, but lots of flowers are falling. What can I do? So good question. And this also ties into that concept of the viability of the pollen and the flower. And so many of the plants that we're growing in our garden, especially tomatoes and peppers, if the temperature gets above about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 32 degrees Celsius, when the temperature starts start getting that high, you're going to have blossom drop. It's too hot. The flower can't handle the heat, the pollen starts dying, and the flowers start falling off, and you're not going to get pollination on the fruit. And so during the heat of summer, you'll see that with a lot of our fruiting plants. They're going to drop their blossoms. They're not going to set fruit. What you can do is try to reduce the temperature. And so particularly early in the morning, if you can have some shade on those plants, like the early morning sun does not start beating down on those plants, put up some shade cloth to try to protect those plants as much as possible. The flowers are still going to show up on the plant, but if you can help the pollination early in the morning before the heat of the day, you're more likely to get pollination, and you're more likely for that flower to remain on the plant. Without protection, the sun beating down is one of the worst things that we can have when it comes to pollination. So just try to protect the plant as much as possible, lowering the temperature with a little bit of shading, because that's most likely the reason that you're having for the blossom drop. Could also be extreme winds. I just had crazy wind this last weekend, and the wind can be enough to blow off the flowers as well. Again, if you can put up some type of barrier to protect your plants from the wind, that can also improve the likelihood that the blossoms will stay on and be pollinated. Okay, Lauraful, thank you for asking that question. What's the background garden today? This comes from Olivia Upel, and this is a garden spot they have. And so one of the things I really like about this particular garden space that Olivia sent me the picture of is that her 9-year-old daughter is the one that's responsible for what you see behind me. It's those pots with those plants growing. It's her daughter that is the one that has the great interest and planted those and set up that whole garden space. So I've said it many times before how wonderful I think it is to get kids involved with gardening. Well, here's an example from Olivia to show what she and her daughter are doing in their yard to grow some pots with the plants growing out of them. So shout out to you, Olivia, and to your daughter, and thank you for sending me this picture. And Lauraful, thanks for asking about it. And if you want your picture shown, especially as we're starting to get into a wonderful gardening time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, or even if your garden's fading in the Southern Hemisphere, go ahead and send me a picture. You can send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, or if you're on the community group for the channel membership on Facebook, I think that's actually how Olivia sent me this picture, sent me a message through the Facebook community page, and here it is today. So I would love to see your garden as we go forward, and I just think it's so awesome to get kids involved. Another idea here. You don't have to dig out beds. You don't have to create raised beds. You can grow everything in containers, whether they be the barrel, half barrels like this, or any other kind of container. So there you have it. Thanks for asking the question, and thank you, Olivia, for taking care of that. Kevin saying the wind has been bad in Georgia too. Everything is staked. Now I have to get shade cloth up because it's going to be the 90s all week. I'm already planning to put more shade cloth up and hail cloth as well this year than I have in years past for that reason. Okay, Bettina, thank you so much for that. I haven't seen your question, Caitlin Rayburn, but if you put @Gardener Scott, it's more likely to catch my attention. Jennifer saying, in the new home with mature fruit trees, and they seem self-pollinating, just one of each, apple, peach, plum, pear, apricot, cherry. Is there something I should do to help them along? So what I would do, and this ties in with the theme of the day, is I would plant flowers and more flowers, and grasses and herbs and more flowers. So fruit trees are pretty dependent on pollinating insects. You really can't expect any wind pollination, and if you shake a tree, it's not going to pollinate, especially with apples that do require 2 trees, unless you have the different branches that have been grafted onto a single tree. You need those insects. So you've got to attract those insects. And so that's where the flowers come in. Just start growing as many flowers as you can throughout your garden area, throughout your landscape, to attract those pollinators, and they will find the fruit trees, and that will improve. Now, even with the fruit trees that are sold as self-pollinating, you can benefit if you grow a second tree of that basic species. And so I have a couple pear trees that are self-pollinating pear trees. And I can expect if I just grew one of those trees, I would get fruit. But if you grow 2 of those trees, this is the craziness of pollination, you will get more because of just the way the pollen flows back and forth between the pollinators. You'll get more fruit if you have more than 1 tree, even on self-pollinating trees. So you got to get the pollinators out there. There really isn't anything you can do to improve pollination. It's hard to throw shade cloth over a fruit tree, but you can get those pollinators into your garden by attracting them with the habitat that they want. The grass, so that they can have some protection, the herbs, so they can lay their eggs, and the flowers, which is where they get their food in the pollen that they eat. So hope that helps you a little bit. Caitlin Rayburn's asking, do you have video over curing nightshade vegetables disease? I do not have that. I don't have a lot that I've talked about on disease, and so I'm not sure if this is a good thing or whether it's ironic. It's on my list. I have a number of videos on my list where I'll be talking about diseases. The problem is I don't have a lot of disease in my garden because I practice methods like allowing air circulation to decrease some of the fungal diseases that might hit the leaves, because I use a lot of mulch, which decreases the chance of soil-borne fungal spores bouncing onto the leaves, because I'm practicing good methods where I try to keep my garden as clean as possible during the growing season. I don't have a lot of disease. And I live in an area where I don't have very many gardeners around me who might have disease that could be transferred in from insects or birds or some other animal. So yes, I would love to do videos like that, but until I get those diseases, I'm probably not going to have a video on that. As you probably know, for those of you that are regular watchers of my videos, I'm showing you what I'm doing based on the research information that I might find elsewhere and my own experience. I'm not a big fan of using pictures and stories and examples from someone else in my video. So if I'm going to show you a video about disease and how to deal with it, I prefer that I'm actually looking at the disease and dealing with it at that time. So if I come across other gardeners nearby with gardens with diseases, and I still don't have that disease, knock on wood, then I'll probably try to do videos about it. But sorry, I don't have a lot of those just because I'm doing things to try to keep disease away from my garden. And if you do that, then hopefully that'll cut down on some of your diseases as well. Linda says, are your fruit trees pruned to be short? I'm nearly finished reading on And Roots Grow a Little Fruit Tree. Great book. You can actually find a link to it in the description below where I've got some of my favorite books. You can click on that link, and Grow a Little Fruit Tree is one of my favorite books. So, yes, my fruit trees are pruned to be short. Now, I did buy, in almost all cases, semi-dwarf rootstock trees. And so if I do nothing to the trees, they're only going to grow 12 to 15 feet tall and wide. But I am planning to keep them shorter than that by pruning so that they're only about 8 to 10 feet tall. And so you can do this a couple different ways when you deal with the fruit trees. The root stock determines how big the tree is going to get. So if you get a fruit tree that's on a dwarf fruit stock, then it might only grow 8 to 10 feet tall. If you get the rootstock that's semi-dwarf, it might get 12 to 15 feet tall. And if you have standard rootstock, which basically means full-size tree, then your tree might be 20, 25 feet tall. So I've gone with the semi-dwarf because I can expect the root system to develop to the point that it's going to support a 15-foot tall tree. But if I prune the tree to only be 10 feet tall, now that means there's more energy going into the tree. It should be healthier. It should mean that there's more than enough root growth to support whatever fruit is growing on that tree. And again, that's one of those ways to try to keep some diseases away from my fruit trees. If I have a really established healthy root system with the wood chips over the soil so that the fungally dominant soil and all that mycelia is helping out my trees, then I can expect that the tree is going to be stronger and healthier and have fewer issues with disease. So in essence, I'm growing a dwarf tree through pruning, but it's on a semi-dwarf tree, which is a bigger, stronger tree. And I could go standard, but this is one of those things that if you miss a year or two with pruning, standard trees can just get crazy overgrown. And I just know my own habit patterns, and sometimes I can't do all the jobs that I want to do. So I'm kind of gaming my system a little bit where I'm growing a shorter tree and still planning to prune it even shorter. So good question. Thanks for asking that. Sue Pfeiffer, thank you so much for that contribution. I appreciate it. And I'm so glad that I can share the knowledge and the information with you. Let's see. Linda says the appendix of Ann Ralph's book has advantages and disadvantages of rootstock. And that's one of those things, if you grow fruit trees, I suggest that you learn a little bit about fruit stock, because as I chose my trees, I think I got almost all my trees, most of them from Fedco out of Maine. I specifically chose their trees because of the rootstock, because I live in a 5B zone and it's dry and it can be late, let's say late winters where spring doesn't come as early as possible. And so the rootstock makes a difference. And so I've had some pretty good success with my fruit trees here in Colorado because I did focus on the rootstock to make sure I chose one that would match up to my environment and what I'm exposing the trees to. So good point. It is one of those things that you should try to look into and get to know more about. Growing with Donnie, what can I do to control powdery mildew on my apple mint? It's plenty of airflow and I don't spray the leaves, not sure what happened. So when you're growing something like apple mint where you actually want to eat the leaves, milk, believe it or not, there's been some studies, and I've tried it and it works okay, is to use diluted milk as a foliar spray. So take some milk and dilute it with water, and I think it's about a 1 to 5 is what you'll often see recommended. So 1 part milk to 5 parts water, put it in a spray, and then spray all of your leaves. And it does have some antifungal properties, and it can act to cut down on the powdery mildew. The air circulation is obviously the one that I always suggest because that can make a big difference. But even if with air circulation, it's all around us. Every garden pretty much in the world has already been infected by powdery mildew. And so it's one of those control issues where you can try to keep it out, but once it comes, you either have to deal with a fungicide or some other activity. And so with something like an apple mint, I wouldn't necessarily spray it with a fungicide because you're going to be wanting to use those leaves. So try some milk as a spray and see if maybe that improves a little bit. And then don't be afraid to prune out some of those areas that have been infected also to improve the airflow and see if that doesn't improve a little bit more. So let's see what happens with that. There you have it. Elsa R says milk is a great antifungal. And Drawing Momentum says, I read that milk cleans tools. I don't know about that. I've never actually cleaned my tools with milk. I don't know that I've seen that. It can't hurt as long as you dry the tool afterwards. So I don't know. Maybe I'll have to look into that a little bit. That's a new one for me. Yeah, Tamara says the milk solution works well on grapes too, because grapes are also very susceptible to some fungal diseases or fungal issues, not necessarily diseases. And so, yeah, there you have it. Spray your plants with milk and see if you can get some improvement. Okay, Elsa says you can use them to propagate, soak in milk, and then dry before potting, or just a few drops in the water and watch her get healthy roots. Okay, thank you for that. Let's see. Prepper Chris says, went through hell last year with powdery mildew. Get to it fast, and I mean fast. Yeah, even in my clean garden where I try to keep away from fungal issues, late in the season, I had powdery mildew show up on my yellow squash. And it was late in the season, and I'd harvested a whole bunch of squash by then. Coincidentally, the next week is when I had that disastrous early freeze that killed all my squash, so I didn't have to deal with it. But one of the things you can think about is hopefully you can hold it back and keep it from your garden until late. But if it infects your plant, your plant's going to suffer, and it will not produce as much as it was producing. And so at that point, consider pulling those plants out. This gets back to the idea of succession planting, where if you are growing cucumbers or squashes or any of those other plants that are susceptible to powdery mildew, and you've already had a pretty good harvest, well, when the powdery mildew sets in, just deal with it right away. Definitely think about pruning off those leaves that are infected, but you might consider just pulling the whole plant and putting something else in that bed. Don't allow the powdery mildew to grow to the point where it's starting to send out new spores. And so you're exactly right. Deal with it right away, because if it's a fungus, and like we talked about at the very beginning, where mushrooms are a fungus and they'll grow, and mushrooms in the soil can be a good thing. Well, at some point, the fungi begins to fruit, and then that fruit will send out the spores to grow new fungi. And that's what the mushrooms are. And so the mushrooms at some point will release all the spores in the surrounding soil, and more fungi will grow. Same holds true with powdery mildew and other fungal issues. If you allow it to stay on your plant and grow to the point that it fruits and then sends out new spores, you've just accelerated the potential problems in the rest of your garden. So get rid of those leaves right away, pull up the plant, put something else in right away before more spores can develop, and you might see less powdery mildew in years after that. So something else that you might want to think about. Yannette's asking, what is the best copper fungicide or Bacillus subtilis solution? I don't know that I necessarily have a best. Copper is a great fungicide. And so if you do a search for fungicide, if you go to your nursery to buy a fungicide, chances are it's going to be a copper solution. Now, there are some bacillus solutions, bacillus being bacteria. So there are some bacterial products that are being developed that have been tested to have that antifungal properties. And so you can spray some of these bacillus products and they'll attack and kill the fungus on the plant. So again, because I don't have a lot of those issues, I haven't tested a lot of those products, so I can't give you a recommendation for what is best. But I suggest you go to the nursery as opposed to a big box store. Big box stores, they're not going to know anything. But if you go to a nursery where they're growing a lot of plants close together in humid environments, and they probably have fungal issues on those plants, and then go through the products to see what they have, they're probably in a much better position to give you a suggestion as to what is best to use. And so it is a definite course of action if you want to kill and keep the fungi from fruiting and sending out those spores, to deal with some of those products with the copper or the bacteria to try to deal with it. But I apologize that I can't give you more specific ones as to which might be best. Okay, let's see what we have. Barbara's saying, been working on growing plants for pollinators. Just realized my 2 squash plants are the only thing in my garden that needs them. So that's good. But hey, you're not going to get squash without pollinators. And so it's great to attract them. So I do want to talk about one other craziness part of this whole pollination. And so almost all plants that are going to fruit require pollination. And that's what the fruit is. The fruit is the result of the pollination. But you can find seeds, and they're going to be more expensive. If you're growing in a greenhouse and you're concerned that you're not going to get the pollination for your plants, look for a plant that is parthenocarpic. And parthenocarpic plants are hybrids that have been developed to grow fruit without being pollinated. And so at the Galileo School Garden Greenhouse, I grew parthenocarpic cucumbers and got full cucumbers with zero concern about pollination, because these plants have been developed, they're hybrids, they've been developed to grow and produce the fruit without pollination. The resulting fruit is either not going to have seed that is recognizable as seed, or if it does have seed, that seed will be sterile and you won't be able to grow anything. You won't even be able to grow a hybrid. And so a lot of the cucumbers, when you are growing or when you're buying seedless cucumbers from the store, in almost all cases, those seedless cucumbers are hybrid. Well, they're going to be hybrids, but in many cases, they're parthenocarpic and grown in greenhouses. And that's why the seeds are so small when you're buying a seedless cucumber. It's because it's a hybrid that's been developed to have small seeds and be able to grow without pollination. So did I just blow your mind on that one? It's just one of those things that hybrids have a lot of options for you as a gardener in what you can grow and where you can grow. And for greenhouses, that might be a step to take, where you grow a parthenocarpic plant just because you don't have the pollinators in your greenhouse. Chris is asking, is it excuse me, is it true creeping thyme comes in rainbow colors? They show everything from red, purple, orange. Is that true? Yeah, it gets down to varieties. The creeping thyme that I've grown have been from shades of purple to shades of pink. But this gets back to the hybrids again, and the plant and seed growers are developing plants, and yeah, you can get thyme in a number of different colors. Creeping phlox and creeping vinca. There's a lot of other ground covers like that come in a rainbow of colors, even though many of us are growing them for the purples. I love the purple in the ground cover, but yeah, you can definitely find some of those. So Janan Johnson's asking about the garden behind me. I covered that a little while back, Janan, so you can rewind and hear me talking about Olivia and her daughter putting up this space. But I already talked about that a little while ago. Sorry you missed it. Okay, let's see what else we have. Let's see. Yep, Chris is saying the moderators are doing a fantastic job, and always thanks to Jay and Heidi. There's a lot that I'm missing as it bounces back and forth. The scroll goes pretty fast sometimes. If it's going fast for you, it's probably going even faster for me. And Heidi and Jay are there to keep things on track, and you guys do a great job. So I appreciate all those efforts. And Gary Norcal, thanks go to the moderators for helping answering questions every week as well. There you go. You guys are appreciated, and I know we say this. I try to say it every week, though I know occasionally I miss, and I know a lot of you out there are thanking them as well. So that's one thing that keeps this live stream rolling along and keeps us all happy and keeps the information flowing, is I can throw out, I typically will answer 12 to 15 questions in a given week along with the topic of the day. But it's really Heidi and Jay and Lauraful and a lot of the rest of you out there that are giving great gardening information as well. So that's why this is such a great community, because it's not just me, it's all of us working together to make us all better gardeners. So thank you so much for that. Kevin's asking, how thick can I plant corn in a 6x6 plot? And so some of it depends on the variety. If it's a variety that grows tall and you're going to get like 3 ears from the plant, you might want a little more separation. If it's a smaller corn where you're only getting 1 or 2 ears per plant, you can grow them a little bit closer. But it varies between usually 8 inches to about 15 inches. And often the seed packet will tell you the recommendation for how close you can get. And so when you're looking at a 6x6 plot, you can easily grow 40 to 50 plants in a place that big. And I'm growing, I'll be doing my popcorn in about a 4x6 plot. And I'll actually go through an entire package of seeds. I haven't opened it yet. I'm hoping there's about at least 40 of the popcorn seeds in that package before I go through it. So I would say go ahead and put as many seeds as you can, at least 40 to 50 at probably 8 to 12 inches apart roughly. And the plant will tell you if they're growing too close together, and you've got some plants that are really, really small. You can thin out corn just like you can thin out any other plant that you're growing in your garden. And so once they start growing, you can go ahead and pull out some of the ones that just aren't keeping up with the faster growing ones to give the faster growing ones a little more space. But you got the right idea. A square with a lot of corn growing in it is exactly what you're looking for. Linda says, due to an injury, I was unable to plant asparagus in a timely manner. The crown sat in my garage for 5 weeks. I just planted the dried up little things. Do you think they will live? I do. Asparagus is just a crazy strong plant. And the plant or the roots that I got last year for this garden were in pretty good shape. They were hydrated pretty well. But at a previous garden about 15 years ago, the asparagus I got was stringy and dry, and I didn't think it was going to survive. It arrived that way, and then it took me a while to actually put it together. And actually, if you go back into my library, it's the very first video I ever did is when I got that asparagus roots and soaked them in water before I put them in the ground. And so I would suggest doing that is hydrate them before you put them in the ground, because the ground, even if it's moist ground, will draw some moisture away from those roots initially. So soak them in water for a few hours before you put them in the ground, and then put them in moist soil, and I bet you're going to have some asparagus. It's probably going to take a while, probably at least a month, if not a month and a half or more, for the plants to emerge. But what have you got to lose? If you've already got the roots, and if you've got a space ready to go ahead and put them in. And even if all of them don't survive, you'll still have some asparagus. But it's pretty tough. I bet you'll have some plants if you soak them and put them in as soon as possible. Don't let them sit in dry conditions anymore if you can help it. Jean-Pierre, bonjour. Good to have you here. I'm so glad that you are here. That's awesome. Okay, let's see. Joe is saying, on the other hand, Hopi corn only grows 3 feet tall. I guess the native conditions are what influence its growth. There you go. So that gets back to the idea of how close together we can grow the corn in particular. If it's a native corn like a Hopi corn, you can probably get away with growing them closer than a sweet corn that's going to grow 8 feet tall. So good. Thanks for throwing that out there. Drawing Momentum is saying, is it best to companion plant different acid-loving plants together to be able to amend soil the same for all, or do they fight for the same nutrients when planted together? Azaleas with pines. Great question. And I've actually already started drawing up the talking points to a video that I'll be doing hopefully sometime next month, where I'm talking about companion plants and the myths behind companion plants and the benefits of companion plants. And you are exactly right with your thinking. It is best to put companion plants in conditions that they both like. So if you have plants that are acid-loving plants, then they should go into acidic soil. You should have a low pH. We think of companion plants as one plant that has to benefit another plant, and I don't see it that way. I've talked about this in recent live streams as well. Part of companion planting is just growing plants in the same conditions so that all of the plants do well. Now, as far as the nutrients, you're going to have a little bit of difference. And so if you're talking about azaleas and pines, for instance, the roots are going to be growing at different depths. And so this is one of the things when we also talk about companion planting and which plants we can grow together. And we've talked about this with growing strawberries in an asparagus bed, for instance, where the asparagus roots are probably going to be about 12 inches deep, and the strawberry roots are only going to be about 5 inches deep. They do well in similar conditions. They come back every year. And so strawberries and asparagus can be considered companion plants growing in the same place, and they're not stealing nutrients from each other because the roots are growing at different levels. The same with azaleas and pines. You can grow them in very similar situations, the acidic soil, and the roots are going to be at different levels, so they're not going to be robbing each other of the nutrients in the soil. This does tie back into the fungal activity in the soil. When you're growing in an acidic environment, particularly around trees, it's going to be the fungi in the soil that really causes the plants to do well. And actually, it works to transfer some of the nutrients back and forth between plants. And so a wood chip mulch in an area like that is really something you should consider if it's not already part of your plans, to develop some of that fungal activity to actually improve the nutrient availability within the soil for those plants. So I was thinking this morning about The Secret Life of Trees, which is another book I recommend that I link to below in my book list. And it talks about how the fungal activity goes back and forth and benefits the plants. And I love the book Teeming with Microbes. There's also part of that book, or there's a book in that series, Teeming with Fungi, that you can also find in that link below. And it's a lot of scientific information about how it all works out. But yeah, anytime you can put two plants in a particular area and that area benefits both plants, we can call it companion planting. I call it just good gardening, because you're taking advantage of your space and giving the plants exactly what they need. So go for it. Okay, let's see what else we have. Tamara's saying the asparagus and strawberries I'm trying out, and also strawberries and blueberries. We'll see how they do. The strawberries and blueberries might not do as well together because they do have different soil pH needs, but I'm glad you're trying it. It's one of those things to try and see how well it turns out. Okay, Drawing Momentum says they have a book on dowsing too. Interesting. I don't have any dowsing books, so glad I could help you along those lines. So keep the questions coming. Let's talk as much as we can about all these topics today. Let me look at my notes to see what else I wanted to talk about, but I might have missed. I've got all the key points. The thing about pollination and cross-pollination, I think that it is really one of those things that you should consider. Attract the pollinators, get those flowers, bring the pollinators in. But like we talked about, even if you've only got 2 plants that require pollinators, you should have pollinators in your garden. But it's nice to identify what plants require pollinators and which don't. And so I said at the beginning where spinach doesn't require a pollinator to harvest the spinach leaves, and carrots don't require pollinators to harvest the carrot root. Well, I have a video on how to collect carrot seed, and I've got a video on how to collect spinach seed. If you're going to save those plants where the actual plant, the harvest that we have, is not part of the fruit or the seed, if it's just the plant, we typically don't think in terms of pollination. But if you allow those plants to grow and flower and set seed, well, now you need to think about a pollinator. And if you're at all like me, I often start the season with some ideas of the plants that I'm going to collect seed from. And then halfway through the season, based on a plant bolting or I don't get around to pulling the plant out of the ground, I change my mind and decide, oh, I'm going to go ahead and collect seed from these particular plants. And I allow them to keep growing. You've got to have the pollinators available for that to happen. And that's why I say plant flowers, plant flowers, plant flowers, because you never know when you're going to need pollinators in your garden, even if you're growing those plants that don't require pollinators. Because you might shift your plan. You might change your mind and you might decide that, oh yeah, I do want carrot seeds. I do want spinach seeds. I do want radish seeds. So you're going to have the pollinators already there, hopefully, because you attracted them with the flowers in some other section of your garden. So James is saying, I was going to plant some tomato plants in my garden, but the soil's a little shallow. If I add more soil to the space, should I wait a few days before putting in the plants? Yes and no. If the soil is amended with decomposed materials like compost, then you can plant right away. If the soil has fresh ingredients in it, and so the microbes haven't got to work yet, yes, I would wait at least a couple weeks for the microbial action to get going in that soil. So it all depends on what you're adding to the bed. If you're adding something that's already aged with and healthy with microbial action, you can go ahead and start right away. You have a little more latitude with a plant like tomatoes, because I strongly encourage that you plant tomatoes deeply. And so if the soil that's in that bed right now is all ready to go and already has that microbe action, and then you add, let's say you add 4 or 5 inches on top of that, well, if you put your tomato plant 6 inches deep, well, the roots that are already on that tomato plant are now going to be growing in that older, nourished soil. The newer soil that maybe needs a couple weeks for all that microbial action to develop is going to be around the stem. And so it's not adversely affecting the plant. And then the plant, the tomato, will start developing roots along the stem after a couple weeks. And now it'll be ready to grow into that newer soil that hopefully has had some time to reach some balance within the garden. So I would say go ahead and, depending on how much soil you want to add, go ahead and put your tomatoes in and just add the new soil around the stems of the tomatoes and you should be okay with it. Okay, Linda says, love that you're looking at your notes. So impressed at your level of preparedness for all of us, not only live stream, but concise and clear videos. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, Linda. I appreciate that. Yeah, I do prepare for it. I hope that it looks that way. That's why I come up with themes and I try to plan out the video a few days in advance so that I can give you as much information as possible. Everything I talked about today, believe it or not, might not be too big a surprise, but this is all stuff that I already know because I've done all of this with the parthenocarpic cucumbers and with the hand pollination and with the dioecious and monoecious plants. This is all stuff that I've known over a period of time with the gardening. But yeah, I had to make notes so that I could remember to bring up all of these different things for you. And I know some of you are taking notes during these live streams. I think that's great because this is something that it's important information every week that I try to give out to you, but it's not all the information that's out there. That's why I always suggest that you take it a step further, take my encouragement and some of what I tell you and learn more about it, especially when you start learning about the structure of flowers and pollination and how it all fits together. It's just, it's crazy. It's science, but it's science at so many different levels that it just blows my mind. I love this topic, so it's awesome. Claudia is asking, thinking of building a bee hotel, where's a good place to locate it? So locating it near your garden is good, and you probably saw my video on bee hotels, which is why you're asking. And it should be in a sunny spot so that the bees wake up in the spring when the weather starts warming up to it. Should be in a relatively protected spot so it's not prone to flooding or excess wind or any winter storms that are going to blow it over or fill it up with snow. It should be in an area at least high enough off the ground that it can't be attacked by predators, particularly animal predators that might want to dig out the young bees. And there should be the flowering plants nearby, particularly the spring flowering plants, because that's when most of the bees in a bee hotel are going to be emerging. And so I've got mine offset a little bit from the garden. You can see the main garden area. You can see it in the background of some of my videos, but it's elevated off the ground so it's not exposed to weather. It is set by a tree and a fence so it doesn't get as strong a wind, and it's kind of out of the way so that the animals I have hopefully aren't going to discover it, and none have so far. So there you go. There you go. Hope that helps. Patrick, thank you so much for that contribution. I'm so glad to be sharing my time with you and everybody else. This is just such an awesome time. There's Olivia, and glad you're here today to see the background. It says this year we put marigolds and sunflowers in our garden. We're hoping it helps with a lot of things. That's awesome. I'm hoping to get, I meant to do it last week, but it was just so windy. I just really don't like working in the wind, and the weather was so cold. But this week I'm putting in my sunflowers. So this year is the year of the sunflower. I think it's the National Gardening Federation. I'm not exactly positive about that, but one of the national U.S. gardening organizations has declared this the year of the sunflower. Sunflower is an awesome plant to be growing in your garden. If I were to only grow one flower, I would probably grow sunflowers because it serves so many purposes. It's great for attracting pollinators. The seeds are great for the birds, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful flower. It also, particularly the bigger sunflowers, can really help break apart compacted soil. So it actually improves the structure of your soil. That's one reason why I'm growing a lot of sunflowers, is for the purposes of improving the soil. So good for you growing the sunflowers. And I hope you send me another picture with your sunflowers. In fact, all of you who are growing sunflowers this year, I hope you send me pictures of your sunflowers to Gardener Scott at gardenerscott.com or through the community membership Facebook page. And that can be a good way for us to share sunflowers in the year of the sunflowers. It's just a great plant. I'm planning on growing everything from 3-foot tall sunflowers to 8-foot tall sunflowers, mostly in my front yard, but I'll also be doing some in the backyard as well. So awesome, awesome opportunity. Lauren saying, any suggestions for keeping squirrels from decapitating my sunflowers? They did last year. Capsaicin. You can try capsaicin. Capsaicin is the oil that makes hot peppers taste hot. And so you can take hot peppers and grind them up in a food processor or a blender with water and use that as a spray. And the capsaicin can keep some animals away, and it's been known to deter squirrels. The issue with that is with watering or rain, it washes off, so you have to keep applying it. So that is a possibility. You might be able to wrap the area with some bird netting, and I've done this as well with some of those flowers in areas where I have squirrels. If you can put some posts, some T-posts, or even some big bamboo poles around the area, and then just make a little fence of bird netting, that's often enough to keep the squirrels away until they can get big enough that the squirrels either decide not to climb them or move on to something else. So there's a couple ideas. I hope they help. But yeah, capsaicin might be an option, but a barrier is really the only tried and true method to keep those kind of animals from eating our plants. So hope that helps a little bit there too. Let's see what else we have. Yeah, thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. Jay is so good every week, at least once, often multiple times. Talks about ways you can support the channel. Thumbs up are easy. Just click on the thumbs up. Super chat, as you've already seen, is a way that you can contribute to the Gardener Scott channel to keep things going. Subscribe, click the bell so you know when new videos are coming out. Join as a member. There's a join button below the videos if you're watching on a PC, and you can go to the home page and join that way as well, or click the link below to become a member of the channel. Yeah, you can click on my Amazon affiliate links. You can go to the Gardener Scott store with all the pictures you see below the videos, with t-shirts and mugs, like my Gardener Scott mug that I drink from. So I appreciate that. There's all kinds of ways that you can support the Gardener Scott channel. You don't have to. This is all free information that I'm spreading out there for all of you, but it does help me out, and it does enable me to do some more things in the garden and do things like get some software and microphones so that the live streams look and sound as good as possible. So always appreciate you reminding people of that. So that's awesome. Okay, let's see what else we have. Nicole saying I have a slug problem in the Pacific Northwest. Just put out beer traps yesterday. We'll see how it goes. They ate many of my pumpkin babies. As dry as my area is, I do have some slug issues around my strawberries in particular. So that's my approach as well. It's one reason why I do encourage some of the animals and the birds in my region. And like we talked about, I think it was last week, talked about snakes in the garden, and I know many of you responded with horror of the idea of the snakes in the garden, but they're great at eating slugs, and so that's one reason why I encourage them. So I hope the beer traps work. I hope it's one of those things that you can lessen the slug population. Ray 55 Roots, so excited about sunflowers. Mammoth, Russian, Lemon Queen, Red Velvet. Good for you. I've grown Mammoth and Russian and Red Velvet. I love Red Velvet sunflowers, so it'll be a good year. Hope you have really good success with that. That's awesome. Okay, so as you're growing sunflowers, as you're growing all the other things that you have in your garden, and if you're planning for next year's garden, do you have a theme? So I talked about this being the year of the sunflower. You could develop a theme. You should grow a sunflower garden, and that's what I'm doing with one area in my landscape in my front yard. Is it will be a sunflower garden, and it will be sunflowers of all different sizes, all different types, just like Ray 55 is talking about doing. I think that's an awesome idea. Think about themes you can do within your entire landscape, but specifically within the garden that you're actively working in, because this is one of those things I think can really bring some excitement and joy, just like you're excited with all those sunflowers you're going to be growing. If you start developing themes within your gardens, it really can expand your gardening world to yet another level. And so one of the things that I'm doing this year is to grow a salsa garden. And so that bed is going to be plants for salsa. So I'm going to have tomatoes that are growing in that bed. I'm also going to have some hot peppers that are growing in that bed. I'm going to have some cilantro growing in that bed. I'm planning to put some onions in that bed. And so in one bed, I'm growing all the ingredients for cilantro, with the exception of garlic, but I have another bed for garlic. And so that's my recipe for salsa right there. You chop up some tomatoes, you chop up some onions, you put in some cilantro and some garlic, and you have salsa. That's it. And so why not grow all of that in one bed? And so now when you're ready to make some salsa, you just go out to that bed and you harvest your tomatoes and your peppers and your onion and your cilantro. And hopefully by that time you've also had garlic that you've harvested from the garlic you planted a year before. And now you put it all together and make salsa. Think about all the other themes that you can be doing. My granddaughters are coming here in a couple days to help me plant a purple garden. It's a theme. The theme is going to be purple, and it's their bed for their enjoyment. I'll be enjoying it too. But when we harvest, they're going to be the ones to harvest all these purple plants. So I already put in purple potatoes, and we're going to be growing purple kohlrabi and purple carrots and purple peas and purple beans, all in one bed. And so the theme is purple. Now, what's better than that for little girls whose favorite color is purple, is to grow a garden and go out there, and when they harvest, they're just immersed in purple in the garden. So start thinking about what you can do with different themes that are in your garden. One thing that I look forward to doing is having a white garden. And so in the space where I'm starting to put more and more perennial plants and growing the flowers and the grasses to attract the pollinators, one section of that is going to be white. Nothing but white flowers. All kinds of different white flowers. Flowers that are ground covered that are white, flowers that are short, flowers that are tall, flowers of all different types. But it's all going to be a white garden. You can expand this if you really want to get into it, particularly with the white flowers, and have a nighttime garden. There are some flowers, most of them white, that don't open until it's dark. And you can go out there at night and see all these blooming flowers that you don't see during the day. And what makes it really cool is the night flowers are pollinated by completely different insects than all of those other plants that we're growing that are flowering during the day. And so the sphinx moth, which is a huge, beautiful moth, is one of those insects that come out at night, and they'll pollinate those night blooming flowers. How cool is that? So think about how you can develop these different themes as you learn more and more about gardening, as you learn more and more about specific plants and how they grow. Some of you may not have even known that there are flowers that bloom at night. So now you can go back and start doing research on that and find what will grow in your garden, in your region, and make a space. I've got a fire pit, and I'll be developing or building a patio area around my fire pit. Well, that's one of the things I'm looking forward to. When all that area is built and we're sitting out in the evening around a fire, is to enjoy the nightlife in our garden. And it won't be too far from there that I can walk into my night garden where the flames will be lighting it, and I'll have all of those nighttime insects. How cool is that? I bet you haven't even never thought about that before. If you have thought about it, I bet you haven't done it. If you have done it, tell me about it in the comments, because this is one of those things that this is next level gardening. This is the kind of thing that so few gardeners even have a concept about, is a theme. What you can do in your garden to make your garden even more unique than everybody else's garden. Now, I've got a big enough space that I can have one bed that's a purple bed, and another bed that's a salsa bed, and another bed that's a white bed, and another area that's a night bed. And so I can do that. You might be limited to just one or two ideas, but even then, try to be as creative as possible. You can have a rainbow bed where you specifically are targeting different color flowers with as many different colors as possible. And that goes against a lot of the recommendations for design principles. Most of the design books will tell you that you should have complementary colors when you put flowers together. But why not grow every conceivable color together and see if you like it or not? This is one of those ways that you can learn about color in the garden, is by throwing as much color in the garden as possible. I'm a fan of swatches of color. So an area that's mostly purple and another area that's mostly red and another area that's mostly white. But I'll tie them together with yellow flowers that are everywhere. All different ways that you can approach the design of your garden space with a theme in mind. I think too often we focus on the plants we're growing for food in our vegetable garden, and then we get done with the harvest and the gardening season is over. Well, if you can start throwing in some of these themes, some of these other areas that involve more than just the food production, now when the harvest is over, especially if you're growing perennial plants, those plants are still growing and you can still enjoy your garden. Just the sitting back and enjoying of it without having to do the work anymore, because the work during the summer and the harvest and all of that is done. Now you can just sit back and enjoy these themes, the visual themes that you've been developing. One of my crowning accomplishments in my gardening career and life was at the school garden, and I built a sensory garden at the school. And the theme was for students to come into the sensory garden and be immersed by the sensations of all 5 senses. And so we had plants that were growing that you could touch, plants that you could smell, plants that you could taste, definitely the plants that you could see, but also the plants that you could listen to. And now most of that listening was because of the hummingbirds that were being attracted and the bees that were being attracted, but some of it was the grass. We were growing grasses amongst the flowers so that when the wind would blow through that area, and there was a bench right there. So I put a bench right in the middle of the sensory garden, right next to the grasses, and you could sit with your eyes closed and just be immersed with all of your senses being exposed to what you grew in a garden setting. Think about doing that as a theme for a space that you might want to build out this year or some other point in the future. There's so many things that you can do in gardening beyond just growing carrots and spinach and tomatoes and whatever else you're growing for the food. Expand it. Think about those other things. For me this week, it's a purple garden with my granddaughters. Really looking forward to it, but there's more to it as well. You'll be seeing that in future videos as to some of the themes that I'm developing. I just added a new element to my garden, the most recent video where I did that stone block bed. That's going to play a role in one of the themes that I'm developing for that area, a circular theme where the beds are round, the plants are actually going to be topiary that's round. I'm already thinking about a round themed area of my garden. It's going to be years before it's fully realized, but I started by just putting in a round bed, and I'll bring the rest of the plants over a period of time to have a round garden, a circular garden. It's all part of the theme that I'm developing. And you can have these themes interspersed with each other. So you could have a white round garden that's edible. There's so many things you can do. So I'm just encouraging right now just to broaden your mind a little bit and think about what else you can add to your garden, or how you can do things maybe just a little differently and get a little bit extra enjoyment out of it because you've developed some of these personal themes, not for me, but for you, what you can do to really make your garden a more enjoyable space, and along the way learn more about gardening and become a better gardener, which is why I'm here, which is why you're all here, which is why we're working together to make that happen, so that you're all becoming better and all enjoying more of it than you ever imagined. That brings us to the end of our time. I learned some stuff today, and I have little doubt that you learned some stuff today too. Look more into all these different ideas and these themes and see what you can do just to make your gardening week a better place in your garden as we move forward to the week ahead. I've got a lot of work ahead. I imagine you've got a lot of work ahead. So let's meet back here on Monday and talk about it next week. So good to see you all, and thank you all for your support and your cooperation at being a great gardener. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.